I'm Marcy Miranda outside the Free Speech TV studios. You're about to see Laura Flanders live in Boston. She was at the Economy Futures Conference talking to economists and professors about the future and the state of the economy right now, both globally and nationally. We hope you enjoyed the show.
What I see happening is not immediate transformation, but I see that the power structure is playing out a hand and hasn't got many cards left. And I simultaneously see people realizing that something profound is wrong. What's interesting to me about Occupy is not only that it happened, but how powerful the response was from other people, because they sensed there's something wrong with this high concentration of income and wealth, corporate power, and that unless you change that, you can't go forward. But the longer haul, I think this is I think we're going to go through a very tough period. I'm not optimistic in that sense. I think it's going to be very painful, but I also think it's going to open the possibility of building an extremely creative political and institution building movement. And I think that the options available to the traditional corporate system are declining. And if you don't like corporate capitalism and the way it works, and you don't like state socialism and the way it works, something as very American is brewing that over time, I think of the 30, 40 years that built up to the civil rights movement, the 30, 40 years that built up to the women's movement, the environmental, that kind of developmental path is, no matter what, it's positive. It's building good things, and it just possibly may begin the transformation of the system. So in that sense, I'm a cool and realistic optimist, but it's the first time in my adult life, and I lived through the 60s, that profound institutional questions are on the table, and that people are beginning to see that some of the old options are not there, so they better roll up their sleeves and get to work. So, and I see a lot of energy. I see a lot of people really beginning to kind of get into the act. So it's very, very important in terms of historical movements, not in terms of who you're going to elect next year. That's a different level, which we've got to fight a lot of battles. But at this level, something very important, I think, is happening.
Well, let's talk about political possibilities. In the industrial model, trade unions, and many people watching were probably members of trade unions, or their parents were members of trade unions. It was thought that if workers could get together and wield power through their ability to withdraw their labor or to negotiate with the threat of going on strike, that would be the way for the less financially powerful people in society to have power. How do co-ops play into a future where there's a different kind of power imbalance or power balance? And what about trade unions? Are they passé today?
Not passé, but in the United States, declining. The great achievement of the labor movement was it reached the 35.3% of the labor force in about 1953. It's now down at the 11% range and at less than 7% in the private sector and declining. So that method, which I'm a supporter of the labor unions and the labor movement, but it is in fact a weakening institutional check on this kind of power. What's happening around the country, I think, is the slow creation of new institutions that slowly displace corporate power. So if you go to a city like Cleveland, the mayor is asked by the corporations for big benefits. Well, he has to bring them in for jobs if he can, but if there's a new development of jobs there, he has more leverage, or in a healthcare system. If you have either cooperative or a nonprofit system, you're displacing slowly the corporate power. And I think that model is growing. You know, the Knights of Labor in the 19th century had this strategy as well. The American movement became conservative in the sense that it didn't have system-changing ideas. Some movements did have around the world. But I think we're going to see the steel workers have come back now. The biggest union in the country just recently has announced that it is going to push for a union cooperative model of building new industry on the same theory. And I think that's important because as the unions begin to open up their own possibilities, using perhaps pension funds to invest, really there's a possibility of serious creation coming out of that movement. It's being transformed. So I think what you're seeing is people actually beginning to look at cooperatives, which are not an answer. They are suggestive of a different way to democratize economic activity. Suggestive only, in some cases very useful, in some cases they're giving us ideas about bigger systems. You know, single payer is Medicare is a publicly owned cooperative system. And it's a 10% of the GDP in some parts. That's a different way of looking at how do we build an economy that's not driven at growth and driven by power and creating these massive inequalities and instabilities. So I think we're opening an era of great political ferment, conflict, construction, theorizing. It's kind of, if you look at it in long terms, it's like the prehistory, and I often use that term. I think we're in the prehistory of the next great transformation, like the women's movement before it actually got rolling to power, like the civil rights movement before it actually got rolling to power. So this is a very fertile and in many ways a very exciting period if you think of it in broad historical terms.
Thinking about where we are right now, I'd say there are two huge, there are two really large problems that we face. One is ecological. We are over-consuming the biosphere. Climate, of course, is the biggest part of this. It's not the only dimension of it, but if we don't begin to dramatically change the way we are affecting the biosphere, pretty soon we're going to see ourselves going down a very ugly and difficult path. The second dimension is that our economic system is broken, the combination of out-of-control inequality, financial breakdown, rising poverty, and joblessness. So this is a moment in which people know we need to fix those things. The conventional solutions to each of those makes the other one worse. So the conventional solution to joblessness and economic breakdown is try to grow faster and more, puts more pressure on the climate system, on the biosphere. The conventional solution on climate and biosphere is to sort of pull back on the economy, and that, under the current rules of the game, creates more joblessness. So we need a way out of this to new kinds of economics that actually can simultaneously solve those two very pressing challenges. If we think about new economy, I'm thinking about three basic new principles. If you look at the operation of capitalist or market economies from the mid-19th century until now, one of the really important principles of a well-functioning economy has been to use a significant amount of productivity growth generated in the market in order to reduce hours of work. Between 1870 and 1970, in the United States, as well as all of the major Western European countries, working hours were at least cut in half, from about 3,000 hours of work down to, well, roughly speaking, down to below 2,000 hours of work, 1,600, 1,500
so with labor-saving devices, new technology, people could actually work less.
People worked less. They got more income because some of that productivity growth went towards creating higher incomes, but a good portion of it went to giving people more free time. And we had an average 60-hour work week in 1870, for example. Western European countries are still on that trajectory. It's a big part of why their ecological footprints are half the US footprint, and their carbon footprints also. In the US, that stopped in around the 1970s, and workers no longer got much of the productivity growth, and it no longer went toward reducing their hours of work. In fact, average hours of work began to rise. So that's a first principle. I mean, there are actually two parts to that. They've also not, many of them have not been getting much of that productivity increase in the form of increased incomes either. But we need to relink productivity growth, which has been good in this economy, and we've got a lot of innovation going on, and we have the incredible productivity growth being driven by the IT sector. Link that productivity growth to shorter hours of work. What does that do? It allows us to reduce our eco-impact dramatically. It allows us to put more people back to work because the average job now is fewer hours of work. Much easier to reincorporate people into the labor force and reverse the job destruction that has been going on in this economy part of why we've had a much worse unemployment problem as a result of the crisis in comparison to European countries is they have much shorter hours of work. And so they've been able to adjust much better, and it's easier to create jobs when average hours are lower.
An economy shouldn't have to grow to function well. Think of the economy as an ecosystem. You know, in a forest, let's say. A forest has basically a constant rate of energy flow. Of course, it varies from hour to hour and day to day, but over the course of a year, taking account of the seasons and day and night and so on, the amount of energy flow is relatively constant. But the forest is always evolving. Species are coming, species are going, there's competition between species. The economy operates the same way. People come along with better ideas, or they're willing to work harder, and they will change the economy. A non-growing economy doesn't have to be a dull place to live. It doesn't have to be static. In fact, it won't be. But it's not going to be an economy that is constantly bursting at the seams and that is consuming ever more quantities of Earth's resources.
You say that in order for a society to be resilient, it needs certain characteristics. Can you describe those?
Yeah. Well, resilience typically means dispersed system control points and lots of localized inventories. The way we've been operating our economy over the past few decades is to maximize economic efficiency. Think of it this way: if you can grow corn in Iowa cheaper than anywhere else, then economic efficiency says, well, we should grow all of our corn in Iowa, don't grow anything in Iowa except corn. That maximizes economic efficiency, but it reduces the resilience of the food system, because if the corn crop in Iowa fails, nobody has corn, Iowa has nothing. So what we need to do is relocalize a lot of our economic activity. That would have the effect of creating more local jobs. It would also have the effect of creating more local inventories and more redundancy generally throughout the system. It's not economically efficient, but it would prepare us much better for the kinds of economic problems that are ahead of us.
And how does that change our democracy, our politics, our culture?
Well, it changes it in very good ways, because if the more centralized our systems are, the more globalized our economic system is, the less say we have in it. You know, people these days feel powerless. They feel as though people in faraway places are making decisions that affect their lives, and they have no way of participating in that. By relocalizing our economies, we're also relocalizing our sense of agency, our sense of participation in what makes the world go.
Let me have Richard Heimberg go back to the question of growth as a relatively recent phenomenon. I think most of us, Richard, think that this measuring of our economy as a function of growth has always been the way that we lived.
Right.
You say not so. It's recent, dating back to when, the 1830s, something like that? Talk about that. What was it like before?
Well, for most of our existence as human beings on planet Earth, we used renewable energy from sunlight. Not directly, of course. We're not green plants. We can't absorb sunlight and turn it into productivity directly, but we grew crops, we cut down trees to use for firewood and so on. And of course, sunlight energy is vast in extent, but the amount that we actually could harvest was pretty limited. And so human economies didn't grow that much. If you look back over the last several thousand years, even though empires were rising and falling, world GDP, the meter barely budged until you get to the recent fossil fuel era, the last 200 years. And it's not hard to see why, because energy isn't just part of the economy. Energy is the economy. Without energy, nothing happens. And if you have available, cheap, abundant, highly concentrated energy, you can do a lot of things. You can transport stuff and manufacture stuff in much greater quantities. And that's what we've done as a result of having access to fossil fuels. So we created a lot of economic growth over a short period of time. But now, as we've run through the low-hanging fruit of cheap, abundant fossil fuels, the game is changing, and economic growth is coming to an end. We see the signs of it all over.
there is a point where increasing consumption is what's important, is what makes us better off. 200 years ago when we were developing the field of economics, that made sense. But now we're really saying the only thing that matters is consumption. Doesn't matter what, if your job is miserable, if, as Adam Smith, you spent all day long sharpening pins, that increases total output, that should be what we do. Now we have the luxury to say, why don't we create meaningful, fulfilling jobs? Why don't we try to have jobs that allow us to interact socially and provide, real pleasure, satisfaction with our lives, instead of focusing on this, this, I would actually argue, the completely wrong goal.
Would you say that the system that you were trained in was so very rational and rules-based anyway?
A couple interesting things about that is I would argue that the system I was trained in is really not even internally consistent. Modern economics is based on 17th century physics. It essentially took the mathematical formulas of Newton's physics and changed the variables so energy becomes utility, and really tried to take that framework. And I think the idea was that economics wanted to become a science, not a moral philosophy. And a science has to have a value-neutral decision rules, which is math. Unfortunately, a science also has to be grounded in reality. It has to be empirically fact-checked, and you have to test your hypotheses. And economists rejected the empirical fact-checking, testing their theories, in order to have the simplifying assumptions required to have a math-based system. So when I did economics, it was pure math.
Well, but doesn't that make sense? I mean, we're told that the economy runs according to rules. Rules sort of like gravity, right?
Well, so the deal is, the way they define economics is the allocation of scarce resources among alternative desirable ends. So the first task you have to ask, first question is, what are the desirable ends? What do we want for society? And what to make the field fit the math, they had to choose as a desirable end the maximization of monetary value. And to maximize monetary value, take a look at 2007 when grain prices tripled. And we buy a loaf of bread that costs $2, probably 10 cents of that is grain price. So you triple the price of grain, little effect on our price of bread, but not too big a deal. But to maximize monetary value, you allocate resources towards those willing to pay the most. So we were willing to pay that 20 cents for bread that we threw away 30% of. Whereas people in Africa, where half their food was raw grain, suddenly the price of their food doubled or tripled, and they couldn't afford to buy food. But to maximize monetary value, you give the resource to the person willing to pay the most rather than the person who needs it the most. If you set up institutions and rules, markets will work to maximize monetary value. But if you question that as a goal, if you think it would be a better use of our resources to feed the hungry rather than to allow the rich to waste more food, then you have to say, well, do we want that set of institutions that leads to this outcome, or do we want to create a new outcome, a new goal, and then create institutions that achieve that goal instead?
So in terms of goals, that goes to the question of what is an economy for?
Yep.
What's economics for? How do you answer that?
So in my mind, I think that there are certain very clear goals. One is, I think some of the biggest, and the goals we choose are based on the threats we face. I think right now most of the serious threats we face are associated with the environment and the capacity we have to disrupt these delicate ecological equilibriums that have been around for tens of thousands of years, let's say. Our kind of stable climate's been about 10,000 years. And so one goal is this ecological sustainability. And that's essentially a question of just distribution towards future generations. I also think there's huge amounts of evidence that people really are deeply social creatures. We care deeply about fairness and social relationships. So this just distribution of the resources that are available to create this an equal and satisfying society is incredibly important. And there's a lot of evidence that societies with a just distribution of resources have better health, fewer social problems, all sorts of, just very simple, better life quality things. And since we have unmet needs and scarce resources, we want to be efficient. We want to use those resources to essentially attain a high quality of life. So the overall goal is a high quality of life, but that implies ecological sustainability, just distribution, and then an appropriate use of our resources.
Now, how is that definition, your definition of what the economy is for, different from the classical definition that you were taught in college?
So what I was actually taught in grad school is that the goal of the economy is to maximize monetary value, which we can put quantitative numbers on. So if we want to be scientific, we've got to have value-neutral, objective decision rules, and so this maximizing some numerical value, which is money, that has become the rule, the goal.
Gross domestic product. We
Gross
want to
domestic
grow
product.
domestic product.
Yep.
We want to grow perhaps per capita domestic product. That kind of number,
Exactly.
that kind of metric.
So that's the metric, and the assumption behind this, what's interesting is, okay, there's the goal we can totally question, but economists also, they totally ignore the biophysical reality of the planet. So I'm actually an ecological economist, not an environmental economist. And ecological economists believe that the economy is the part and the ecosystem is the whole. And it's a law of physics that you can't make something from nothing. So everything the economy produces requires the transformation of raw materials from nature. And you can't do work without energy, so it requires fossil fuels essentially. And you also can't make nothing from something. So all the energy we use and everything we create for the economy eventually breaks down, wears out, falls apart, returns to the ecosystem as waste. And when you extract, those raw materials we extract from nature are also the building blocks of our ecosystems. And humans, like all species, depend on healthy ecosystems for survival. And when we remove the raw materials and spew back waste, we destroy the capacity of our ecosystems to regenerate resources and to create oxygen and to clean water and to provide all these services we need for our survival. So that, we have to preserve the ecosystems. Conventional economists, on the other hand, believe that human ingenuity essentially will solve any problem and the economy can grow without limit forever. So this idea of exponential growth, and that we want to double the amount we consume every generation, and the only goal is more material consumption, which I think is biologically or biophysically impossible and undesirable. I don't want my grandkids consuming 8 times what I consume. I'd rather have them have healthy communities and good relationships with nature and all these other things that we're sacrificing to achieve the wrong end.
But the classical economist would say there are a lot of people that don't have what your grandchildren have, don't have the chance of having what your grandchildren have. We need to create wealth, to create development, to bring up the floor for the least privileged, the least affluent, those in developing countries that need to develop.
And I would say if that is our goal, let's pursue it directly. We're not going to get there through growth. If we believe we have a finite planet with a finite amount of soil, a finite amount of fossil fuels, and a finite amount of resources, the more we consume, the less there is for others. If you believe in this infinite growth, then you can make or infinite planet, essentially. I believe in the finite planet hypothesis. But if you believe in an infinite planet, then you can make the argument that growth will eventually alleviate poverty. But if you fact check that empirically, you look at what's happened as we've grown, we're not seeing a decrease in poverty. In spite of doubling our consumption levels.
Globally, would you agree there's been a decrease in poverty?
Globally, I would say there has been a decrease in poverty. I was just reading that one of the big decreases in poverty in India has come about because they've redefined it. It was making less than $1 a day, now I believe it's making less than 62 cents a day as poverty. So that's one way to decrease poverty, is redefine what it is. But also, if you believe in this idea of a finite planet, as we, most of our economic production right now, people attribute this incredible economic growth in the past 200 years to, to the magic of the market. I attribute it to the magic of fossil fuels. A barrel of oil, it would take 20,000 hours of human labor to do the work in a barrel of oil. So I assume if you convert that oil to work that we really use and you lose 75%, it's about 5,000 hours of human labor in a barrel of oil. And that has been the magic of economic production, is this boom using the fossil fuels, but fossil fuel output has not really increased since 2005, in spite of, at one point there was a 300% increase in prices that couldn't drive up the output by more than 3%. And so we're reaching the limits of this ability to increase economic output. So it's been an unsustainable short-term blip in economic output, and we have to recognize those biophysical laws. We need to develop a more equitable approach to the economy that there's, whereas we would consume a lot less in the developed nations, which does not mean we'd be a lot less happy. It means we could pay a lot more attention to spending time with our family, preserving our natural ecosystems, developing ourselves as humans, culture, arts. That I would say we've solved the economic problem of enough consumption for most of us. And now the important thing is to make sure that everybody has access to the basics and then put our energy and our resources into doing what really matters.
Hi, I'm Marcy Miranda outside the Free Speech TV studios. You've been watching an exclusive FSTV program. We sent Laura Flanders out to Boston to the Economy Futures Conference, and that's what you've been watching. She spoke with dozens of economists and professors of economy to talk about the globe, the global economy, the national economy, and what's to come down the pike. And if you like this kind of programming, we need you to join us and help support us. Go online at freespeech.org or give us a call, 877-378-8669. Become a member. You've heard us talk a lot about the Occupy Wall Street movement and activists and protesters, and you may be at home thinking, well, I'd love to join, but I don't know how I can contribute. Well, this is a perfect way to do it. Join us. Give us a call, 877-378-8669, or donate at freespeech.org. We are the media for the 99%, the media for you. And if you like what you see, I have great news. There's more, tons more, online at freespeech.org. We've got books, DVDs, CDs, this kind of media that you like watching here, expanded, available to you online at freespeech.org. While you're there, check out our new website. We've revamped it. We've got lots more archived stories and footage from Democracy Now!, from Tom Hartman, from Al Jazeera, Fault Lines, The Stream, all the shows that you know and love because Free Speech TV brings them to you. You can find them there alongside with a simple application for you to join and become a member, freespeech.org, or give us a call, 877-378-8669. We're an independent media source for the 99%, not corporate media. We're not sponsored by corporate media. We're sponsored by you, our viewers, and that's why we need you to join us and become a member, 877-378-8669, or doing it online at freespeech.org. If you love waking up to Amy Goodman and hearing Tom Hartman and watching those shows, we love bringing them to you, but we need you to help support us to continue bringing them to you, to continue bringing you these stories that affect you, stories of foreclosure and student debt, stories that you don't hear about in the mainstream media, stories that don't affect people of the 1%, they affect you, the 99%. And we understand that better than anyone else because we are a nonprofit and we don't take money from those big names. We're not afraid to name names. We're independent, and we can only stay independent if you continue to help us keep it that way. Become a member right now. Donate online at freespeech.org or give us a call, 877-378-8669. You may think, well, I'm on a fixed income. We hear that all the time. And you know, every little bit helps. $5 a month definitely helps. Break it down to 17 cents a day, $10, whatever you can afford is more than enough for us. But you know, the more the merrier. So if you're out there, give us a call. There's never been a better time to support independent media than now. You may think, what can I do to help those Occupy kids? What can I do to really make a difference in this world? And this is a step in the right direction. You can help us continue to bring these stories to light, bring these stories out of the shadows, out of the corporate media shadows, because they don't cover this, but we do. We need you to continue to support us, to make sure that that continues happening. So do it now, online at freespeech.org, or give us a call, 877-378-8669. We've got tons of volunteers and staffers just waiting for your call. Help us help you continue to be educated and to learn about the sorts of issues that other people don't want you to hear. 877-378-8669, or donate online at freespeech.org. We're independent. We are the media for the 99%. We're the media for you, and we're going to continue to cover these stories because we're passionate about bringing them to you. And we know you want to hear them, and you have a right to hear them. But we need your help to make sure that that continues to happen. So now's the best time to support independent media. Thank you so much for your time and for your generous donations and support.